and good afternoon, and welcome to a new segment for us, which is a Friday virtual learning series session for the Federal Youth Network. So hopefully everyone who has signed on to the webcast is in the right place. So today will be an Ask Me Anything session. So this will wrap up our month of programming on diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, accessibility. We're really here to have our panelists answer your questions. And we'll start with some of the questions that were brought up over the last 4 segments over the month of November. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am joining you from is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. I'd like to acknowledge that our panelists are joining us from a variety of unceded territories across Canada, as well as our participants who are joining us really from coast to coast. This session will be bilingual, alors si vous voulez demander les questions en français ou en anglais, les bons sont acceptables. Et puis, on peut poser les questions dans la langue de votre choix. So please feel free to ask questions in the language of your choice, using preferably the Q&A function. But if that's not available on your screen, you can pose your questions in chat, and then we will ask them of our panelists. Today we have several panelists joining us, so they will share their wisdom and experience on the issues of anti-racism, inclusion, and diversity. So I will mention that today we have with us Susan Woodhouse, Liz Martin, Layla Shahid, Jeremy Tate, and Heather Hamilton. So I'll go to each of our panelists to give a brief introduction of yourselves to our audience today. Jeremy, I see you on screen, so we'll start with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm Jeremy Tate, and I'm with Indigenous Services Canada in the Atlantic region. I'm a manager of the Indigenous Liaison Unit in our Amherst office, but I'm working out of my home in Moncton, and pleasure to be here today.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, next we'll go to Susan, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, or it might be morning for some of you. Hi, I'm Susan Woodhouse, and I presently am the Special Advisor on LGBTQ2+ issues for the Canada School of Public Service. I primarily am a positive space ambassador and trainer of our positive space courses for the school. I'm on an interchange, and I get to do lots of fascinating things about LGBTQ2+ issues, along with relating and connecting with other equity-seeking groups. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks very much for joining us, Susan. Okay, next, Layla, if you would like to give a brief intro.
Hi, everyone. My name is Layla Shahid. I am a policy analyst at the Department for Women and Gender Equality Canada. I work on horizontal integration of gender-based analysis plus across collaborating with various government departments and agencies on capacity building in the context of gender-based analysis plus and diversity and inclusion. I'm also the lead analyst for the policy direction to modernize the Government of Canada's sex and gender information practices, which is the tool to reintegrate how sex and gender information is captured, used, and displayed. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Layla. Okay, next, Liz, would you like to give a brief intro?
Bonjour tout le monde. Je dis bonjour parce qu'en fait, ici, il est à peu près 10 heures du matin. Donc, je m'appelle Elisabeth Martin. Les gens m'appellent également Liz Martin. Et je vous parle en fait de la Colombie-Britannique. Hello everyone. I should say good morning because it's early morning here. I'm Elisabeth Martin. People call me Liz Martin, and I'm from British Columbia, and I'm part of the FYN, the Anti-Racism Ambassador Network. So I'm not today I won't speak on behalf of AREN because it's a grassroots movement, a collective made of public servants. So I will speak with my own voice. I'm just part of this collective. Merci.
Merci, Liz. And finally, Heather, would you like to give a brief intro?
Hi, and thank you for having me. My name is Heather Hamilton, and I work for the Parole Board of Canada, based in Edmonton. Just happy to be here. My work has nothing whatsoever to do with diversity issues. It is a personal interest of mine, so I'm not speaking on behalf of my department, nor do I speak to you from any sort of deep academic expertise. I am speaking to you just from my own, based on my own interest, my own work in the area, and then my own personal experiences and sort of tackling these kinds of issues. So that's kind of my context.
Great, thanks very much, Heather. So we'll get started with, we already have a question in the Q&A. So as a reminder, please pose your questions in the Q&A and then we'll pose them to our panelists. Et vous pouvez les poser en français ou en anglais, so please feel free to pose those in the language of your choice. So the first question that we have is from Pamela, and the question is, when introducing yourself to others, how do you tell them what your preferred pronouns are? So for example, do I say, my name is, and I prefer she, her. The second sort of part of that is, if you don't know someone's preferred pronouns, is it safer to call them they, them, or stop mid-conversation and ask them? And then the third part of that is, when someone calls you out or corrects you for not using inclusive, well, actually, maybe we'll tackle that next part after we delve into the pronoun. Pamela has provided a very detailed question. So around that question of introducing yourself and indicating your pronouns, and then around the topic of, if you don't know someone's preferred pronouns, what's the safest approach to use? Who would like to start with that question? Susan, over to you. Sorry, Susan, and I think you just muted, actually.
Yeah, I'm used to WebEx and the symbolism is a little bit different. Yes, thank you for that question. My pronouns are she and her, and basically just saying your pronouns is appropriate. I would caution you from using the term preferred pronouns. We use terms like preference when we're talking about, I prefer strawberry ice cream over chocolate. But we wouldn't be insulted or affronted in any way if I got chocolate ice cream, whereas not using someone's pronouns, it could be problematic for that individual. So yes, just introduce yourself. My name is Susan. I use the pronouns she and her. If someone else has not offered you up their pronouns, feel free to just use the gender neutral pronoun of they and them throughout your conversation if you need to refer to them. And for the most part, as soon as you offer up your pronouns, other people are more likely to offer up theirs as well. So you've kind of made it a safe place for people to talk about their pronouns. And not only that, but you've just recognized that somebody may have pronouns other than the binary. So I think that answers two of those questions. And if you can clarify for me if there's other things you'd like me to address, it'd be great.
Yeah, no, I think that covers it. Would anyone else like to add on to that point? Layla, over to you.
Well, I mean, I would just add that I think it depends a lot on context, and I keep coming back to context, obviously. So I'm looking at the first question in terms of the, introducing pronouns. So yes, just as Susan mentioned, just mentioning my name is Layla, my pronouns are she and her. Yes, the preferred language sort of implies in an option element that should be taken out. It's sort of like, even in the context of, and that's a bigger debate, but bigger conversation to get into. But even in the context of like gender and gender identity, there's a back and forth around mentioning gender identity to allude to transgender and gender diverse people instead of, and gender meaning just cisgender people or people who are not transgender. And so that itself also implies that it's an identity, but it's really not a thing. So it's that same kind of a nuance that can flow here with the preferred language. So just keeping it simple, saying it, that this is just, yes, pronouns, putting it in email signatures, email blocks. I think introducing it also when everyone does it, it really normalizes the usage of this way of communicating with each other. Now, sometimes because so many, I mean, I have an incredible team. I work at Women and Gender Equality Canada, and like everyone, people have their pronouns and in their signature blocks and so on. And it feels weird to me when I come across names and tags that don't have pronouns. And I think in terms of also, if you don't know someone and you don't know someone's pronouns, it's safe to just mention them by their name, you know, because again, or you can mention them using the gender neutral they. I think the one nuance there though is, again, depending on how safe you feel or what the context or situation is, like, or how safe the space is. When we talk about safe and brave spaces, like it can be trickier to also ask people for their pronouns because they may presume that you know, you're like, someone might be like, someone who may not be exposed to gender diversity and inclusion concepts might be like, are you presuming, like, are you questioning my gender? So again, I always sort of veer towards, you know, also caring about people's safety because that's important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the email signature, I think, is really important. So I think I would encourage everyone, if you don't already list your pronouns in your email signature, do that. Let's make this as normalized as anything else. And you know, it doesn't matter if you use the, you know, what would be the sort of heteronormative pronouns, but listed on your email signature. So the second part, or the third part of this question, so when someone calls you out or corrects you for not using inclusive language, how exactly do you acknowledge that? So who would like to tackle that part of the question? Susan, over to you.
I just don't want to be the only one speaking. So obviously, if somebody calls you out for using gendered language, if you were unaware that that was something that was inappropriate or hurtful, you do what you always do no matter what. If somebody's, you know, was hurt by something you've said, you apologize. Don't make it a big deal. Don't talk about, oh, I didn't intend that, I'm terribly sorry. It's just like, sorry, and thank you for pointing that out to me, and move on, because you don't want it to be about yourself. But I always refer to those kinds of situations as aha moments, learning opportunities. So if I get called out on something, and I have been called out on several things over my career, it's just a matter of that, incorporating that and then sharing that aha moment with other people so that they don't make the same mistake. So I've had to say, I've done this wrong in the past, especially when I'm teaching. So by me sharing you my information, my aha moment, the person that, or the situation where I got challenged, I get to now share that information with you and perhaps pave the way so that you won't make the same mistakes that I have. So share the knowledge whenever you can, and get excited about being challenged, and that you deal with it with humility and but not without making it a big issue.
Absolutely. We'll move on to the next question. So yesterday was a Leaders GC chat on allyship, and I think it was a really interesting topic to cover from various perspectives, and really active engagement from the audience in terms of that discussion. So the next question from Alia is on allyship, and her question is, how do you have conversations with friends or family in your inner circles who have called themselves allies and believe that they are acting as allies, but you notice their efforts are performative and not active? Do you call them out and talk to them about it? Do you inform them that they cannot self-claim the word ally? So who would like to start with this? Heather.
I'm always troubled by the term call people out. because I would love to think that we work in learning spaces and teaching spaces and sharing spaces, and that we're not sort of, gotcha kind of journalists trying to catch somebody in a mistake and call, haha, I got you, right? I would rather say that maybe challenge is a better word. Educate might be a better word. I think it's fair to ask people about what's the impact of what you've done. Talk's cheap. What have you actually done to deliver that? And I think there are the kinds of gentle and probing questions that can bring that out. What's the impact of what you've done? How does that manifest itself for you on a day-to-day basis? What are some of the things that you've actually done, and how has the community responded to what you have brought forward? So I think there are some questions like that that can maybe prompt people to think that through a little bit more, hold people a bit more accountable to make sure that what they're doing actually has some impact without sort of creating a confrontational situation. Because of course, as soon as you do that, people get on the defensive, and then you lose the opportunity to actually have productive and meaningful discussion.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to chime in on this question around allyship and dealing with sort of friends and family and that sort of context? Nope. Okay, so we will move on to the next question. So this is from Julie. So when using gender neutral pronouns, in the last session, you mentioned the pronoun they could be used instead of he or she, even though it's commonly used as a plural pronoun. Do you have any suggestions for gender neutral pronouns in French that could be used to replace il or elle? Layla, over to you.
A little bit, I have a kind of a shaky hand up because this is a very sort of a new area of work. I know that there are academics working in the area of gender diversity and who are French, like francophones or like, French language experts that have been proposing options. One that seems to sort of I've come across multiple times is IEL, I-E-L. But honestly, like this is like I think it's a very nuanced kind of a discussion that would be implemented depending on the context, depending on the awareness and conversation with the actual person who is, who is requesting that. They may themselves have recommendations on what pronouns to use, given that they are francophone and it's in that context, and they're more likely to be aware of that knowledge themselves. So in terms of writing, as I'd mentioned last time as well, there are quite a few resources on the Translation Bureau website on gender inclusive writing in French. And there's many ways to make writing inclusive, and terminology and grammatical and syntax sort of approaches that are really helpful to frame written language. With the oral one is a bit more, it's a little bit of a nuanced kind of a.
Yeah, absolutely. Would anyone else like to provide any additional context around that question? Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Layla said is that, oh gosh, no, train of thought, come on. Yes, you'll notice that many government departments, they have form letters. And those form letters in both French and English are written in such a way that they're gender neutral. And they do that. And again, I'm not French, so I don't know how that is done specifically in French, but it's about changing the focus from a verb to an adjective or a noun or something. I can't remember what it is, but it's already being done just out of expediency, because the Canada Revenue Agency isn't going to, for every form letter in French and or English, they're going to look up, and if they have access to know what gender the person prefers, to change the letter, right? They simply write the letter in a gender neutral way that will apply to both anybody regardless of their gender. So there are a lot of examples out there. There's a lot of written forms already out there. It does take a talent. It does take a changing the way you look at it. But as Leila says, there are resources, and I think it's through Treasury Board Secretariat and also through Wage, I believe, Leila, they've also got some stuff too. So just research it on government websites and they'll certainly help you out.
If I may say something, yes. Personally, I will say it first in French because I think it's important, and then I will switch it to English. Personnellement, en fait, ce que je recommanderais, c'est en fait d'utiliser le prénom de la personne ou alors peut-être le prénom de la personne et utiliser en fait la deuxième personne du pluriel, qui est aussi une forme de politesse, vous. De cette façon, cela vous empêche en fait de faire un faux pas. So what I will say is that personally, what I will do is use the first name of the individual and then use the second person of the plural, which is a form of politeness in French, which is vous. And then it allows you to avoid the missteps.
That's great. Thanks, Liz. So the next question is from Tanya, and the question is for you, Liz. Are any public servants able to join the Anti-Racism Ambassador Network? If so, how do we go about joining?
Absolutely, absolutely. You will be more than welcome to do that. So you have different ways. You can either contact us, for instance, if you go to Twitter, you will find us, or on our GC collab page, for instance, we have a mailing list. And I believe that normally our social media tag handle will be tagged. So you should be able to use it. So it's at RN Network _PS, and you will be welcome. You will be very welcome. Great question. Thank you.
And I believe Marcellus put the link in the chat as well for the Anti-Racism Ambassador Network. Awesome. So we're going to go to a pre-planned question that we had. So the question is for all of you. Do you feel enough is being done to teach the next generation of public servants on issues of anti-racism and the importance of an inclusive and diverse public service? And Heather, it's been a little while since we heard from you, so maybe I'll start with you for the question.
Short answer would be no. I do not think we're doing enough on that. I think this is a bit of a unique problem, which actually I shouldn't say that. I encountered it when I worked on environmental issues as well. Part of the challenge that we have on issues of when we're dealing with issues of racism is people think it's a solved problem. So if you ask people, do you think that racism or discrimination is wrong or is a bad thing, they'll say, of course it is a bad thing. Luckily, we don't have that problem here in Canada. So I think the issue isn't that they don't think that it's important or that they don't have a concern about it, but the level of concern is low because they think that it is a solved problem. I didn't see a cross burning on a lawn this morning. So clearly everything is okay. So I think there is definitely work to be done, not necessarily to convince people that racism where it exists is a problem, but to show people that it exists. And that to show people that this kind of discrimination exists. And I think it's linked back to our whole concept of our whole idea of privilege and unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is unconscious. And so by definition, people are unaware of it. And so there is always, for every individual, and I would say at the macro level for every organization, there's always going to be an accountability to make sure that people are conscious of it. There's always going to be a need for that sort of active work, because if you're not living that experience, why would you know about it? How would you be aware of it? fascinating conversation with a person who's part of the LGBTQ community, and he asked me, how many times a day does your gender and sexuality matter? And my answer was 0. As far as I'm concerned, 0. Maybe when I'm going to a public bathroom, then it matters. And of course, as I'm saying that, I know obviously that's not the case, because I'm aware that people are having a different experience from me. I have no idea how that manifests itself, because that's not my own experience. And I think if you can relate some of those things back to yourself, bits of your own experience that you know are unique to you. Another one I know I've talked about before is being in a group, and was at a seminar, and the person said, can you list for me all of the things that you're doing on a daily basis to avoid being assaulted? The men in the room are confused by that question, right? But most women can rattle off a list a yard long easily. I don't walk alone in the dark. I don't leave a drink unattended. I park under streetlight. I call when I'm going somewhere. We can easily run down a big long list, because that is a normal part of our experience. And I think just making sure people remain sensitized to that, and just remember your experience is not a universal experience. There are other people who are facing a whole different set of challenges than you are. There's always, by definition, because it is unconscious, there's always going to be a need for us to do that continuous sensitization. What about these other people? What about those people? Are we addressing all of the needs of all of the Canadians that we serve? That's an ongoing challenge.
Absolutely. Jeremy, we haven't heard from you yet, and you are very involved in furthering education and awareness for public servants. So what are your thoughts around this question of, is enough being done to teach the next generation on
right. Right. And it's important that all the voices are heard at the panel level, because it's the diverse group. So we talk about Indigenous racism right now, and the media with safety checks from police officers ended up in people being shot. And there is no, like big narrative around how it gets to where it is. But we just heard an interview where a police officer laughed when they asked, how many times did she get shot? And those type of language, right? So it's normalized that we're able to get away with discriminatory language in our workplace. So back to what the other panelists are saying, it's the language we use on a day-to-day basis. And some of it is the conscious and unconscious. And some of it's conscious in the sense that the systems we work within allow it, because we're in workspaces where it's been normal to discriminate, even not knowingly, but our policies allow for it. We're able to discriminate against certain communities because of financial indicators. And then we use the words like, they're not performing, they're not doing this. But at the same time, we're also saying we're not helping either. So we always come with the blaming attitude, and the blaming language usually ends up a finger being pointed at somebody. But I like what was said earlier about the teaching and learning. A lot of things I talk about on a day-to-day basis is you take every moment or every interaction with a person is either a teaching moment or a learning moment. And those are gifts. So if you look at that, it's really about mindfulness and being open-minded to criticism, to be brave to receive criticism, and to be brave to learn. And it's the hardest part, to learn every day, because sometimes we get so caught up in our day-to-day that, we probably work and live alongside people that think like us. And then when you get out of that norm, that's the hardest time to break your unconscious bias. So a lot of times for me, it's even challenging myself and processing words that I may use, and stopping to think, and challenging myself to not be the smartest person in the room, because you're not. There are many people, there are many backgrounds, and there are many things going on in every space that you're in. And because they're so diverse, you have to take every opinion as its new thought and a new idea, and embrace it, because you don't know where it's going to go. So another thing I like to do in any space I'm in is plussing ideas. There's no such thing as a bad idea. So when you're looking at it, it all comes down to language, how we interact with one another. And if it's done in a positive way and in a learning environment, that's the public service I would like to see. Is it the public service we're in? In these domains, it is. We're here talking, preaching to the choir. We have people at these activities that are already thinking like this. How do we get folks that are not thinking like this to these activities? The ones that are too busy because they're doing all the important policy work, but they're not talking about the workplace they're in and how they can change or adapt to it. So I think about the folks that show up to all the learnings I offer. You're preaching to the choir. You're talking to the folks that are already like-minded. It's how do you get the ones that are, labeled as the harassers or the discriminators to these events, so that they could be in the same room and say, wow, I didn't know that. So that's when we get into challenging moments. We're in a boardroom, we're forced to be together on a project. And that's when we start to see discrimination and systemic discrimination and the unconscious bias, because our work dictates that we come together and we have to work together. Those are the spaces where we have to really be mindful of how we help each other think about things and how we talk to each other and build a better, more positive workspace.
Absolutely. Liz.
Thank you. I would like to thank the previous panelists because it was very important to hear what they said. I just would like to add my 2 cents. I'm a proponent for educating people. I'm a proponent for extending the hand because we all change. We are not perfect. We make mistakes. And I can tell you that in my personal life, I met people who evolve, and it was beautiful to see their transformation. So teaching about unconscious bias is great, but it has to be tackled with accountability because otherwise we won't go anywhere. So what I would like to add is we had also to tackle hidden biases because not every biases are unconscious. It's not true. I would even say that one of the reasons why racism is perpetrating and keep going and going and going and going and going is because it is profitable. Let's make it clear. You see that you have a colleague who is highly educated, who is assertive, and for whatever reason, you want to get rid of it. What do? You weaponize skin color or ethnical background, and all of a sudden, this person goes with some tags which are assassinating your character, especially in the workplace, aggressive, unapproachable, not a team player, etc., etc. If we want to get rid of it, we have to make it costly and unacceptable. And I said it last time, I am tired for this nonsense. We should have a zero tolerance policy. We are public servants. We are here to serve Canadians, and they come with all their intersectionalities and diverse backgrounds. So if we want to serve Canadians properly, we should hire a diverse workforce and we should include them, making sure that they have a proper seat at the table and they are able to voice what they have to say, and they are not here to serve you as your token. We are not here for doing any window dressing. The other thing that I believe is important, and that makes me very nervous because I hear a lot of things about anti-racism, anti-racism, anti-racism. Yes, we have to talk about anti-racism, but where I'm very nervous is when I have this feeling that we are trying to equate the experiences within the racialized community. And that shouldn't be the case because we already saw the pitfall of the GBA. We don't want to do the same thing. Anti-Black racism cannot be equated with another type of racism. I'm not saying that we should discount some type of racism. No, it's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you want to properly make sure that you eradicate it, make sure that you use specific tools and effective tools, not a standardized approach with a standardized solution. And 20 years from now, we will still be here. Because one of the greatest issues is that whenever you try to eliminate an issue, what does it do? It cripples down, it cripples in again, back, and sometimes in a more pervasive and a worse form. So unless you set up some proper mechanism and a proper enforcement tools to make sure that it won't creep in back, we will go back and do the same thing. Isn't it the concept of insanity?
Yes, of doing the same thing and not learning going forward for sure. Thanks very much, Liz. Heather, over to you.
My colleagues have touched on some of the points that I was thinking of. I just wanted to go back and sort of clarify a point. I do think there's a fascinating survey it's Ipsos did and has done for the last few years, which is definitely worth a look, about Canadians and their perception of racism. 60% of Canadians right now are saying that they think that racism is a serious issue that needs attention. 60%, that's a big leap. The last time the survey was done 2 years before, it was about 47%. So the number has grown substantially. There's certainly a much greater awareness. But in the same survey, we saw 49% of Canadians say, I have racist thoughts, I just don't share them in public. 49%. And I'm going to argue that a good chunk of the other 51% are probably lying to themselves as they do that survey. Their unconscious bias is a pervasive problem, but there's also very conscious bias, and we shouldn't miss that. If you think you live in a racism-free society, I would encourage you to go to any news site and read the comments. Don't read the article, but read the comments of what people are saying and what people are talking about. I've actually decided not to do that this week because I'm beginning to lose faith in humanity based on some of the things that I'm seeing there. But I think you might be astonished to hear some of the overt racism that people will openly espouse when they're in a forum that's, they're hidden behind a keyboard. It's out there. Jeremy also mentioned an interesting point, which is we talk about unconscious racism today, but for a long time, racism, discrimination, bias was actually policy. So it would be astonishing, for example, if there was not issues of bias within the police. For about 150 years, the police were on hand to enforce policies that were intentionally discriminatory. Those things exist within our lifetime and they continue to exist today. So there's still a lot of policies out there that are intentionally biased. There are issues, things that are designed to be to create bias and discrimination, and we shouldn't gloss over those. They're still out there, they're still pervasive, they still exist, and we really do need to tackle those as well. So it's I think about just all circles back to the need to just really keep our eyes open for those kinds of problems in all of their forms, for those who are, sort of not aware of things they're doing that are harmful, and for those who know or ought to know that what they're doing is harmful. Those need to be rooted out as well. So I just need to not lose sight of both of those streams that are really important for us to face, and not fool ourselves into thinking that, we've got all of our ducks in a row. Now we just need to persuade the people. There are still some deeply rooted policy issues and systemic issues out there that we need to tackle. Absolutely.
And I think it's been an interesting sort of 4 years having the dichotomy of Canada and the US and the paths that each country has taken on diversity and inclusion and anti-racism. But I think some of that has given us the illusion that Canada is immune to racism and that it doesn't exist to the same extent.
We look good by comparison, Josh. We look good by comparison, but I'm not sure that's good enough for us. When we consider what our Canadian values are, I'm not sure that being better than the America that we see today that is not nearly a high enough standard for me, and I suspect for most of the rest of us in this room.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think it creates a false narrative that, well, we're not in the same circumstance, so we have less to solve. I think we have a lot of the same issues, and from a systemic basis, but a lot of the same issues to tackle going forward. So the next question came in from Aaron, and the question was, I think this is great on an individual level, but I wonder how you think we can make systemic changes as public servants. So they point to you specifically in terms of updating signature lines, land acknowledgements, that they're great, but it's not enough. So where does kind of the action come in? How do we make those systemic changes? Layla, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, since I mentioned the signature lines, I guess I'll respond to this question. I think there are varying levels in which change takes place, right? It's systemic, institutional, interpersonal, And oftentimes with systemic changes, there are, and as anyone who works in or with policy work, you would know that literally things take decades to move, right? The machinery is the way it is. There are so many stakeholders involved. There's so many systems in place. And so to say, I think that, yeah, I'll just go back to my point earlier that there are varying levels of change. And when we implement these smaller changes, it doesn't negate the need for larger systemic change. Oftentimes, in fact, you know, one sort of complements the other. For example, I will talk about the policy direction on modernizing sex and gender information practices. This comes from Bill C-16, which was originally published in November in 2016. So it's almost already now 5 years ago. Received dissent in 2017. Policy comes into place in 2018. Work happens. First it was with TBS, now it's with wage. Like, see, already it's like 5 years. But that policy and that bill, Bill C-16, is the inclusion of gender identity and expression in the Canadian Human Rights Code. It signifies a huge, you know, step forward in our systemic processes. Just the machinery is so slow, it will take time, but it is, because it is now in the law, it is enforcing changes to take place in how we conduct our gendered in that one sphere, but again, always intersecting with other factors, and as Liz had mentioned earlier, absolutely the historically, like the focus, you know, on in the context of GBA plus has like the methodology and approach towards intersectionality has not been concrete enough, and it needs to be strengthened. People don't even know, many people have a hard time grasping intersectionality as a layered and intertwined concept of varying systems of power and oppression working together. That's a whole nother beast. But basically, you know, I think when one thing happens, then it sort of reinforces the other, right? So absolutely. And I think also I want to sort of a word of sort of like, not advice, but like caution, but like, I think also our role as public servants, right? It's like that balance between, I think there is a space for pushing for change, but also then creating change and recognizing the value of it, and but also then sort of balancing it with our role as public servants and following the sort of the you know, the process as it comes through the pipeline in Parliament, and then what our role is and what our jobs are, and serving the government of the day kind of thing, right? So it's that balance you have to find. I mean, activism is sort of one thing, right? And then, you know, being a public servant is one thing, and finding that fine balance to push for change consistently, strategically on an ongoing basis, developing good relationships while doing that. I think it requires a lot of, you know, patience, it requires strategy, it requires, you know, good, you to be flexible and curious and in tune with a lot of, you know, systems. So definitely important work, but oftentimes tough work, which is also why as someone like I do policy work and I do facilitation in my off time, and also sometimes in my current role. That's not my main role to do learning facilitation. What I love, for example, facilitation work is you see, oftentimes, you see people get aha moments when you're working with them. Aha moments in policy work take years, right? In the realm of policy, and in classroom learning, it literally takes a class to see that happen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Leila. Would anyone else like to chime in on this question? Yes, Heather.
I just wanted to say that I'm a firm believer in that saying of do what you can with what you have, where you are. And I also just look back at historic issues. I think when you look at big problems, it sometimes seems like, where do you start, right? It's such a big thing. It's like, how do we feed the hungry, right? It's such a huge problem that it can be unmanageable. But if we look backwards, we have a long history of solving huge problems exactly like that. There's an environmental organization, whose name escapes me at the moment, that did a fantastic video where it showed some clips from the early 80s of people talking about the environmental movement, and some really smart policy leaders and advisors saying things like, we are never going to be able to persuade people to recycle paper instead of throwing it in the garbage. Who's going to separate their cans at home? No one. And now these are things that we just do as a matter of course. These are normal. Some great video people talking about how the entire auto industry will grind to a halt if we take lead out of gasoline. Now it's just gone. Looking back in my own career, I remember coming into the public service in 1991. Women in the public service were a rarity. My first supervisory role, I was the only woman on the management team, which was true for probably the first 10 years of my career. Now it would be really weird to go into a room and not see a good presence of women around every table, at every level in almost every field. So we have made changes like that. It is possible. We've done it before. We can continue to do it. I would also add that, you know, we mark the big milestone moments, but what's sort of less visible are all the little steps along the way that sort of sensitize people and made the way possible for those big milestones. We've had, you know, milestone change on LGBTQ issues in the last few years, amendments to marriage rights, correcting the wrongs that have happened to LGBTQ personnel in the military, for example. Those are huge milestones, but those aren't switches that flipped. Those are little steps of people doing one step here and sensitizing there and raising awareness here and slowly chipping away until we got to a spot where people looked around and said, wait a second, this law doesn't make any sense anymore. This is not, it's no longer a reflection of how we feel. So as hard as it is, it's hard to be patient. We look back and think we've been talking about these issues for 100 years. Why aren't they fixed now? We also have to just appreciate that we are making some headway forward. It is possible. We've seen that we can fix these issues. I suspect if we come back to the public service, or even just to our Canadian society as a whole, in 10 or 15 years, we'll be having a different conversation than we're having now. We'll be in a different space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So don't give up.
No, absolutely. And it does take a long time. And I think the importance of each of you being here is that you've worked from both sides of that equation of, you know, building sort of grassroots movement from the bottom up, and then dealing with it as leaders in the public service in terms of getting the message out and getting the change to happen from the leadership level. So I think that's it's very important to have both of those elements happening. Susan, over to you.
Yeah, just as a wrap up to that whole comment, that's line of comments, is that yes, we have to recognize we've come a long way. Yes, we need to celebrate those things for sure. I've celebrated many things over the course of my career. And yes, policies changes take a long time, but we want to make sure that we don't fall into the pit of, well, everything takes so long, and well, you know, I'd like to do that, but you know, I can't. Ultimately, as public servants, our number one underlying code of conduct is respect. So in no matter what, you can always challenge the powers that be, that how is this policy, how is this procedure respectful to, and, you know, broaden it out. But as we need to be a little patient with ourselves, don't fall into the pit of being, you know, acquiescing to the powers that be or whatever, because there's a cost to that. Every time we don't take action, the people that pay the price are those equity seeking groups. So for every time we don't do something, somebody pays, and it's not usually those of us that have any power. It's always those that are more marginalized.
Absolutely. I'll take a moment to remind our audience that you can pose your questions using the Q&A function. Alors, vous pouvez poser les questions en utilisant les fonctions questions et réponses sur votre écran. Et puis, on va les poser dans la langue de votre choix. So we'll be posing questions in the language of your choice, so either in English or French, using that Q&A function. So please feel free to add your questions in there.
Josh, you just wanted... Yeah, I just wanted to add something, just in summary of all the things that have been said to date. I think the biggest step that I've seen since I've started in the public service in 2001 is social media. So we've had social media in our personal lives, but I find the social media platforms that are available to us now, the GCpedia, GC Connect, GC Collab, have allowed us to collaborate across boundaries and speed up these processes. So I'm a part of probably 20 different networks right now, just able to speak my mind, you know, in like-minded groups. And I find I'm on some national meetings that are working groups that are moving the marker on things that are important to us, but they're much faster because we're finding people much quicker. We're breaking down the silos so quickly. And I think for the rapid movement of information, I think there are a lot of people that are influential in the public service, and they don't have to be at senior ranks. I find even like the lowest ranks have the ability to influence policy. And I think our social media, taking advantage of those platforms that are internal to the government, will help us advance the work much quicker than in previous decades.
Absolutely. So the next question is relatively specific, but the question is, I've been asked to host in employment equity and diversity inclusion learning activities for a group of employees that will be made mandatory. I think it would be important to talk about uncomfortable subjects such as racism, colonialism, feminism, intersectionality, power, etc. What are things I should keep in mind going into this? Is it a bad idea? How do I acknowledge my own identity as a white woman speaking of these concepts? So I think interesting sort of specific question, but I think generally, you know, when people are kind of approaching this of, you know, how do you kind of get that message across? I think we've talked about, you know, the folks who are joining us as participants today are probably, we're probably preaching to the choir. But in terms of, you know, rolling out sort of broader training to employees and getting that message across to them, how do you go about it? And what do you think of the topics proposed in terms of covering, you know, racism, colonialism, feminism? Yes, Leila.
Well, I mean, as someone who does this kind of work, not in my government role, but in my other hat, and I have worked with, you know, institutions such as like Parliamentary Protective Services and the Ottawa Police Service. So, you know, these are crowds where you require like a certain type of, there's a flow and energy required to get the message on diversity and inclusion. And so basically, I think that it depends a lot on the context and audience, like in terms of, you know, your one's own lived experience and who your audience is. Like, you know, I mean, if there were more details provided, maybe I could offer more advice. But basically, I mean, one way in which I've seen facilitation done is, for example, having, you know, like a diversity of always having two facilitators. I'm not sure what they mean also by host. It's sort of like someone's hosting and you're hosting, and like as a person with that lived experience on and diversity issues, and you're hosting a discussion and there's a panel, that's like different. But if you're like leading and guiding a facilitated training or discussion, and I think then I can see where and why that can be a bit, you know, tricky to have no lived experience whatsoever. But I think it also depends on, say, having a co-facilitator with lived experience, so you can sort of, the audience can connect to the learning in different ways, right? So having someone who is, say, I'm a racialized woman, if I have, say, a white male colleague with me doing the co-facilitation, that would otherwise get a message across in an audience that may be more resistant to messaging from someone like me, right? So that's like one strategy. Having, you know, guest speakers and so on is also another strategy. But I think also there's pros and cons to mandatory training, and also the training, the way in which it is implemented, because one-off type trainings on anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion have been shown to be actually not very helpful, because they create sort of resentment in the audience for racialized and like historically underrepresented or excluded staff, because people will be like, okay, so now this facilitator came and she told us we're all bad people for not including you, and now we're going to punish you more. That's the gist of it. So the way in which training is done, it's laid out. The longitudinal strategy on it has to be, you know, well coordinated, well planned. There has to be a strategy in place. You can't just do one-off trainings and say and sort of call it a day, right? That's kind of all. I could go into this for days, but that's all I'll say for now.
Absolutely. Heather, over to you.
I think there's maybe worth a while to step back for a second and just re-examine the question in its own context. And one of the things I always ask is, whose issue is this, and whose problem is it? So I don't think that anybody needs permission to speak or be engaged on this issue. The issues of racism are not my issues. Issues of bias against LGBTQ community are not their issues. We have an obligation, particularly in our role as public servants, to help define and shape and be a leader in what kind of society and what kind of a government workplace that we want to participate in. So I don't feel like I am not a member of the LGBTQ community. I don't feel like I need permission to say, hold on a second, that's not fair and that's not right. So this isn't my issue. And I think you have to acknowledge that when you're speaking outside of your own experience, and you can't speak on behalf of a community, but you don't need anybody's permission to speak in the interest of a community or to speak as an advocate for that community in terms of embracing and recognizing the need for it. I also think we need to ask ourselves a little bit about, why is that conversation uncomfortable? And Layla touched on it a little bit. And I think a big part of this is we sort of divide the whole world into two buckets: the good people and people who are biased. Which is foolish. We all have some degree of bias. You cannot be raised in this society and come away completely unbiased. It's just not possible. I always try to explain this to people by saying it exists on a spectrum of that. And most of us fall someplace in the middle. Very few people on the, way on one end or way on the other. Most of us fall somewhere in the middle. And it's about being conscious of where you are on that spectrum and how do you nudge yourself a little closer onto the side of the angels as you're proceeding. And I think that historical view of good versus evil is what raises people's resistance. You're saying that if I'm means I fit in the bucket of bad people and I don't want to be there. So I think normalizing that conversation and saying, listen, we all have these, we all know that this is a problem. Everybody deals with this to some degree. All of us speak and understand the world from our own perspective. It's okay to acknowledge that this is a concern and a problem. Now, what can we do to help fix it is important. I think we also have to think about get out of the conversation of blame. None of us created the situation. Isabel Granger, wonderful speaker, works on diversity for Ottawa Police Services, but she said something I thought was really powerful, and that is, none of us created the situation, we inherited it, right? We all inherited it. We're not responsible for what happened to the past. We didn't build this system. We are responsible for what happens in the future. And that's what we're talking about, is what kind of future do we want to build? So if we can get away from the concept of blame, whose fault it is, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, can we just sort of sit in a room and say, listen, we're all part of this society. We all see a problem. What can we do to fix it? Then we might be able to move past some of that uncomfort, that feeling of discomfort, and that feeling of this has to be somebody's fault and somebody needs to be punished. Because as soon as you get into that, then everyone says, okay, how do I make sure it's not me? I'm not the one that's getting punished for that conversation. So I think reframing it and just making it okay. We all see this problem. We all have a role to play in it. Let's just fix it. Can maybe take some of the energy out of that. I think when you're speaking from a community you're not part of, you have to remember that you're bringing to it some power. As a white woman who is speaking on issues of diversity, you speak with a perceived independence that gives weight to your speech. When I'm speaking, there's always a sense, well, obviously I've got a vested interest, right? When you are speaking without a vested interest, you bring to the table a degree of power that allows you to have influence in places where I or other people might not. So don't give that away by thinking it's not my issue, I can't speak on it. I think you have to come with a humility, as we all do, of understanding that you can only speak from your own experience, but that doesn't mean you don't have permission to participate in or foster a discussion.
Absolutely, that's a great point, Heather.
I think, oh, sorry.
Over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the points highlighted just before I spoke were brilliant. I completely and wholeheartedly agree that it is everybody's fight. We shouldn't leave it to just a few segments of the population. I agree with that. For me, it's not too much I don't have so much questions about a white woman, for instance, facilitating such a training. It depends on how it is done. We have also to be careful and mindful, because we are touching about experience and trauma. So we have to be very, very, very sensitive. When you haven't walked in someone's shoes, don't judge, don't lecture, be careful, because it's a touchy subject. But my question also is, I'm curious to know who designed the training, because that is an important question as well. Because if you don't bring and you don't involve in a meaningful way the individuals who are the most impacted by this issue, what are you training about? What is it? Isn't it a performative act then? So we have to be careful here, because it circles back to the concept of inclusion. And because diversity without inclusion is just window dressing or tokenism. So make sure then that you include properly and you listen to the people who are affected and who are bringing their lived experience and who are able to enlighten you and tell you what they need to make a change happen. And one more comment, it is true, I agree with Leila that when you read some researchers and reports, you can see that after trainings, you have some resentment. Unfortunately, equality always comes across as oppression for people who come from a situation of privilege. And we will have to deal with it, because at the end of the day, we want an equitable society. We shouldn't lift ourselves up by pushing down others. We should lift each other up. And that's the type of society that we want. So no pain, no gain.
Absolutely. And I think your point of, bringing in people from the communities in order to develop, training, develop materials is very key. I think we know that, a room of male executives can't get together and solve gender equality, and we can't, get a group of people together to represent the interests of other communities without involving those communities in that design and that co-development, for sure. Susan, over to you.
Yeah, just a few comments. There is a statement following up on that, or a process of basically nothing about us without us, right? So in any kind of design, you need to make sure that you are including the right people. There was a couple of issues, though, that the person brought up. First of all, that there's potentially that there's mandatory training for people, and that is always tricky. But if you are not a person from within those communities for which you are doing some of this training or hosting, you actually have an opportunity to role model what it is to be a person of privilege, acknowledging their privileges and not feeling victimized or feeling like, oh yeah, it's all about me, being able to acknowledge your privilege and that you have had to learn things and that you're a better person for it. And it has opened your eyes in the world for not only yourself, but others. That's always a nice way to go. If that's mandatory training, you really do have to put into place some safety components, whether it's a baseline of we will have this discussion with respect, and I as a facilitator or the host will call out things that are disrespectful, because anybody that's from one of those equity seeking groups that's sitting there watching you do this, if you let some of that stuff go, it is no longer a safe place for them. And they may either shut down, turn off their camera, or are going to say this was useless, because it needs to be, and I'm not saying complete safety, but as long as those things are challenged, then it increases the participants' trust in the system and in the host or whatever. So mandatory training, it's really questionable as to whether it's effective or not. There's a lot of different beliefs around that, but it does change the dynamic. So you have to prepare yourself for that as well, of ways that you're going to be able to handle it. If somebody says something that's racist or homophobic, how are you going to do that? And sometimes it's a matter of eliciting the input from other allies that may be in the room. So if I, as a white woman, hear somebody say something I think might be racist and I'm not even sure, or is inappropriate, I may call upon other people and just say, how do other people think about that statement? What did it do for other people? And that gives people either the ability to step up from personal experience to say, well, yeah, that in fact was inappropriate, or another ally to come forward and saying, I used to think that too, and I had to double check myself, or I had to check myself. So make sure you've got allies, especially in the room, especially if you've got mandatory training, because you may get resistance.
Absolutely. Heather, over to you.
I wanted to say a quick word about mandatory training, because I have done this before in my role as RDG group, made training mandatory. I absolutely agree with Susan in what she's saying. You have to make sure you have a safe space. You don't want to create a forum for people to, batter those who are already bumped and bruised and dealing with trauma that they have already had. But a word in favor of mandatory training within the public service and other organizations, some of that has to do with setting expectations. And I know as a decision maker, I've been in this situation before. I'd like people to understand what I'm doing. I would like people to support what I'm doing, but whether they understand or support it or not, this is the behavior that I require, right? So some of it is about sit down at the table and let me clarify with you that these are the things that I expect. I'd love for you to come out of here passionately supporting what I'm doing, but whether or not you think it's a good idea, whether or not you're in favor of it, that's what I'm requiring from you. So there are some moments where that has to happen. It's about creating clarity and setting expectations. It's mandatory training can be a hard way to sort of win somebody's heart, but it is a very clear way of saying of controlling somebody's behavior, because you are setting these clear expectations from them. So it has its moments, it has its spaces. It's in the world of the carrot and the stick, the mandatory training is sometimes the necessary stick. It's my court of last resort. But as a manager, I have gone there sometimes because I've gotten to situations where I said, listen, I've done my best to persuade you. Whether you agree with me or not, this is what I need you to do. And sometimes you just have to go there.
Absolutely. The next question is around intersectionality. And in French. Alors, la question c'est, est-ce que la conversation sur la diversité et l'inclusion dans le gouvernement maintenant met assez d'emphase sur l'intersectionnalité selon vous? Comment peut-on aider sur ce point en tant que fonctionnaire? I think intersectionality is the hardest word I've had to say in French today, so that's nice. So do we put enough emphasis on intersectionality in terms of how we look at diversity and inclusion, and how can we help to further this point as public servants? Liz, si c'est d'accord avec vous, je vais commencer avec vous en français, si vous pouvez. Parfait.
Oui,
merci.
Je vous en prie. Personnellement, je trouve en fait qu'il y a encore du travail à faire, définitivement, en ce qui concerne l'approche intersectionnelle. Et ça, c'est extrêmement, extrêmement important. Je parle en tant que une personne qui s'identifie en tant que femme et noire. lorsque je regarde, par exemple, les statistiques, je vois en fait que la communauté noire est regroupée, comme si nous étions un groupe monolithe, alors que nous ne le sommes pas. Les expériences, par exemple, des Noirs américains des États-Unis, ces expériences-là sont différentes, par exemple, des Noirs canadiens, et qui ont une différente expérience des Noirs des Caraïbes, qui ont une autre expérience des Noirs venant d'Afrique et des Noirs venant d'Europe. Donc, je pense en fait qu'il est important de traiter en fait ce problème parce que pour moi, en fait, ça vous permettrait en fait de pouvoir atteindre le goal, le but d'être inclusif. Et je sais que c'est très compliqué parce que ça ressemble, si vous voulez, à un oignon et vous devez le peler. Une couche après une autre, après une autre, après une autre. Et c'est douloureux et c'est méthodique et ça prend du temps. Mais une fois de plus, en fait, nous sommes à un moment clé où on ne sait pas dans combien de temps les gens, en fait, accepteront encore de s'asseoir à une table et de réfléchir à des solutions pérennes. Donc, c'est le moment ou jamais.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Liz. Heather, Layla, Jeremy, Susan, would you like to chime in on this question?
Je pense que c'est très important de considérer quels sont des points où nous avons des similarités. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de points de similarité. Nous sommes tous des personnes, nous sommes tous des questions de respect, par exemple. Mais comme Liz vient d'expliquer, il y a toujours une grande différence entre des communautés différentes et à l'intérieur des communautés qui sont qui sont des grandes communautés, il y a quand même des différences à l'intérieur de cette communauté. Je sais que c'est un grand problème pour les communautés autochtones, où on utilise le mot comme c'est un grand groupe similaire, mais il y a beaucoup de différences. Mais je pense que où il y a des points de similarité, ce sont des grandes questions de respect. Et si on commence avec des questions de respect, on va trouver qu'il y a beaucoup de points où on peut travailler ensemble, où l'expérience des groupes différents, c'est une expérience en commun.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll go to the next question. So the next question is around sort of allyship. So do you have any suggestions for how to know when to step up as an ally and when to let people speak for themselves? Layla, over to you.
So I actually, I was looking at some of my earlier notes. I had done a workshop a few months ago on allyship and in the context of community relations and in Ottawa. And so I will, and I was thinking about this earlier when the question about allyship also came up. So to me, there's almost sort of like 4 pillars that are, around allyship, and some can mimic allyship and some are like actual allyship. So I think one aspect we have to talk about when we discuss allyship is saviorism. And this may take the guise of allyship, and in the context of, say, discussions on anti-racism, it would disempower racialized communities in the context of, gender discussions. It disempowers women and LGBTQ people and implies people with, said lived experience do not know what they need to solve a particular solution. So again, does not meaningfully engage, as Liz had mentioned earlier in the earlier discussion. And then there is, silencing is another sort of pillar that can mimic or, surround allyship, and it centers yourself. It is reactive. It is oftentimes based on guilt, but it can seem like you are positioning yourself in a stance of being someone who cares about the issue. So of course, if I'm being emotional, I care about the issue. It's not always the case, right? And then there's allyship, which is actual allyship, which is intentional, proactive, unconditional, decenters oneself. And then there's another term that's, not oftentimes used enough, but that is accomplices. And accomplices are willing to make, this is like the 2.0, ally 2.0, like a good, solid ally. An accomplice is willing to make sacrifices, stays in the background, and is taking steps to dismantle harm. So I hope that kind of gives a good positioning on allyship and being an accomplice, which should be, a goal when we talk about allyship.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to contribute on this question? Liz.
I agree with what Leila said. Yesterday, Erin, and particularly Alia and Ali from Erin, were involved in a GC leader Twitter campaign, and they were discussing about allyship. So A for action, L for listening respectfully, the other L for learning with humility to engage in the struggle, and the Y yielding a power balance and towards co-designing solutions. What I would say is, to me, the way that I would see an ally and the way that I'm trying to act as an ally is not being, well, it depends on the context, but taking actions means that when the individual, for instance, needs a backup support, don't be quiet. Don't stand on the side when you see that the person is oppressed. Speak up, do something, because otherwise you are accomplice in the, and this time in the negative way, because you are reinforcing something that should be nipped into the bud. The other thing is, I'm trying to walk side by side with the people that I'm trying to be an ally for, right? I ask them, what do you want me to do? I'm trying to engage with them, to educate myself, to be humble. And if they tell me, I need you to do this, I do it. I'm not trying to be their spokesperson when they don't need me to do that, but I'm trying again to be their backbone, because personally, it's what I would need from an ally. And it's what a little bit what Leila said also. Don't use it. Don't use certain cause as a prop to sell something or to boost something. It's about the other one. It's not about ourselves. It's about the other one.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. What is privilege? And why is it important to include this in our discussions around anti-racism, inclusion, and diversity?
Ooh, that's one of my hobby horses, Josh. As I've said before, we can't see our own privilege. And I think privilege comes with receiving benefits, receiving advantages that you may not even know are advantages and which seem very normal to you. I will say, sidebar, in my work as the parole board, I'm increasingly discovering what a privileged and charmed life that I have led. As I see people coming through the criminal justice system and raising issues and concerns and talking about a life where I didn't know if I was going to have dinner that night, or my parents abandoned me for a week and I didn't see them. I'm realizing increasingly what a charmed and privileged life that I have led, without recognizing that, just because of the strong family supports that I've had, and had no idea that it never occurred to me that, not the whole world is enjoying all of these things that I enjoy. So I think privilege is about those kind of benefits that have come to you that are not earned benefits. They're coming to you as a function of your situation, as a function of the color of your skin, of your prosperity, of your whatever, things that have the gifts that life has given you that you have not necessarily done something specific to earn, and maybe that you shouldn't necessarily have to have done something to earn. They're pretty foundational things. And I think understanding what that is and recognizing that is really important. I do try to give people, for whom that isn't obvious and for who haven't had to deal with that every day of their life, examples that I think that they can relate to. I've talked a lot in other forums about the advantage of height that height gives you, and that if you go into Fortune 500 companies and look at height, you'll discover that Fortune 500 CEOs are on average 4, 5, 6 inches taller than the rest of the world. Why? Why is that? It's because of systemic bias that has rolled cumulatively to give them advantage throughout their life and has put them into that situation. Did they do something bad? Well, no, they haven't done anything to make themselves taller, right? So, and you know, have they asked for anything? I'm taller, so I would like this benefit. No, it's just things that are coming to them. And I think the more experiences that you have of that, where you begin to be able to see what your own privilege is, it's because there's a whole world out there outside of your own experience that you simply can't see. One of my favorites recently was hearing a friend of mine who is a well-known musician, and he was talking about how outrageous it was. He was in the bathroom and somebody came up and started talking, oh, I'm such a big fan, and you know, I love your music and whatever, and he was so outraged and I didn't get it. The man at the table had to explain to me, apparently there's some code. Men don't talk to each other in the bathroom, right? So talking to each other in the bathroom, big violation of the guy code. This is weird to me because women talk to each other in the bathroom all the time. You have a whole conversation with a person, a complete stranger through a bathroom wall. That's a normal thing, at least in my experience. And I realized how would I know that? Why would I? That's not part of my experience. There's a million things like that that are happening all around you that are related to your own experience and sort of how you face the world. And until you see that it's happening differently somewhere else, you're not going to know that they exist.
Absolutely. Your mention of height and sort of prompted me. I think it was included in some books I read a few years ago, and I think it was some extremely disproportionate number in terms of, you know, 85 or 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs were 6'3" or taller compared to like 1.5% of the average population, and also they were white women.
It's very, very dramatic difference.
Yeah,
very dramatic. I believe it's 8 times over representation in that group than anywhere else, and I love that one because for me, it's a good example of one of unconscious bias. You know with certainty that when someone walks into a board of directors, I'm here to be interviewed or considered for the role of CEO, you know that the people around the table aren't going, let's just hire the tall guy, right? That would be stupid and counter to their own interests. Nevertheless, they are hiring the tall guy. So what's going on there? You can see that there's something going on there that is not conscious or deliberate. Nevertheless, it's still apparent, it's still present. It's helpful to see that there because the same thing is happening for other groups. There's a lot more going on, why they're all white, why they're all male. The same things are happening there. They're just a little bit harder to see because our own values are so deeply tied up in them that it's harder for us to recognize. But because you can see it with height, hopefully that opens people's eyes and lets them see that it could exist and does exist on all of these other characteristics that are a little bit harder for us to see because our own privilege and our own experience is somewhat in the way.
Absolutely. Jeremy, it's been a little while since we heard from you, so maybe we can go to you in terms of your thoughts around privilege and the importance of including this when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and anti-racism.
I think some of the points are important that were raised before. Is privilege it moves with you and it shifts depending on which room you're in. So what group you're among. So you talk about, you know, being at the parole board and seeing the value of the privilege you have. So it's the same as Indigenous communities when we look at recruiting individuals from communities. One of the biggest barriers is that they don't want to work for the federal government because basically it's the Indian agent. But by the time an Indigenous person gets a job with the public service, then they're shunned as like, you know, you must be the smartest one, you must be whatever. But there's privilege that shifts in your day to day as you move from one area of your life to another, and that can happen multiple times a day. So recognizing the group you're with, and like, you know, we talk about walking into a group of CEOs and seeing you're the shortest one there. You already know you're at a disadvantage. and being conscious of that. And it's unconscious or whatever. It's one of the hardest things to put a label on. But I watched one of the it's a YouTube special, and it's they were talking to a comedian who was white, and she said she was pulled over by a police officer, and she said she never feared ever, you know, being pulled over by a police officer, and she even yelled at the police officer, and she felt, you know, she had the ability to do that. And then she was having an interview, and it's the series is called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, and she said, now if you got pulled over by a police officer, would you feel safe to scream and yell at a police officer? Like, no, I fear for my life. And she says, that's white privilege. That's my privilege. I have the ability to know that that police officer is not going to do anything regardless of what I do to them, with the limits of violence itself. So just examples of little things like that to be aware that I think, and you know, Heather mentioned it, but your privileges depend on where you are, and to be always aware of that. So I don't feel comfortable in every space I go into. My privilege shifts as soon as I walk into a group of senior folks who I don't see myself represented by. So then talk about allyship is how do you get the allies in the room to shift that privilege to you? And I like being in a space where someone will say to me, you know, Jeremy, now it's your turn to speak, and everybody listens. So the shift of privilege is shifted to me because now the focus is on my speech or my words. And I think that's where, when we talk about privilege and shifting control to individuals and allyship, is we can take advantage of all those spaces. And I do like it when I am in a room and someone is actually living the experience, or it's a way of life to be an ally. It's a way of life. You have to think about it all the time. And I think certain departments are better at it than others, but I definitely know it's not easy for everyone as a public servant to walk into every space and feel that comfort. And that's why I think anxiety goes up in different spaces that we're going in, because we're comfortable here. And I can go to another boardroom and have anxiety. And that's part of the unconscious biases and privileges that are existing in that space. So it's fluid. Absolutely.
So I see we're getting towards the end of our time. So as a final question to each of you, so we've had I think an incredible discussion over the last 88 minutes on diversity and inclusion and anti-racism and allyship and so many topics. So as a follow-up for our participants, do you have a sort of next step for them, a book to read, an article to check out, a course to take, some sort, like what would be your kind of go-to of, you know, how can people continue their learning, their awareness, and their understanding? Sorry, I'm putting you all on the spot in terms of this, but who would like to start? Susan, over to you.
Well, as an employee of the Canada School of Public Service, I would highly recommend any of the events that we put on. Then we actually have a course on unconscious, unpacking your unconscious bias. And I put a link in the chat also of a really good little TED talk about unconscious bias as well. And then we also have our LGBTQ2+ awareness course called Positive Space. So that's my plug for sure.
Great, thanks, Susan. Heather, I see you put in the chat, Shattering the Glass Ceiling.
I did. I had the privilege of hearing Isabel Granger speak, and she did such a wonderful and powerful recitation, recount of her own experiences coming up through the police force as a Black woman at a time where that was, well, up to now, where that's still an unusual thing. There's an excellent book called The Skin I'm In, which is fascinating. It's based on a magazine article that is definitely worth a read. There's another book sort of taking the world by storm called White Privilege and Why It's So Hard to Talk About that I would recommend as well. And there's a wonderful TED Talk by, oh my gosh, what's her name? Paula. It'll come to me. I'll look when I'm done. But it's a transgendered woman who talks about her experience and all of the unexpected things that she experienced when she shifted from living as a man to living as a woman. All of these things that came up that she had no idea were suddenly become part of her experience, moving from sort of a privileged group to a group that faces so many more challenges and disadvantages. I'll find it for you and put it in the chat screen.
Oh, I think Aaron said Paula Stone Williams.
Oh, that's it. I keep forgetting her name, but yes, Paula Stone Williams, her TED Talk, definitely worth a listen. It was an eye-opening experience. Just one of their funny moments is just talking about I get my hair cut half as often, but it costs me 10 times as much, for example. One of her observations. So yeah, there's some really good things out there, some good resources.
Absolutely. Okay, over to you, Liz.
I would say Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Fabulous book. And if you can read James Baldwin, and you will realize it is so apropos. And it is daunting because his work dates so many years ago, and it is still apropos. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. Layla, over to you.
Well, I just shared a resource. There's not so much a book or like anything like that. I shared a resource in the form of a person I have followed and whose work I admire greatly. Her name is Kim Kachin Milan, and I've posted her website on there. She's a Toronto-based Black, queer, immigrant woman. She does excellent work, and if you follow her on like social media or on her, various channels and mediums, she does, she's great resources and great person to, engage with if your department is like looking to bring people in, kind of thing. And one of her quotes that I love and that I want to leave the space with is, treat people the way they want to be treated. And I'm not sure if I mentioned that in my last panel, but basically you can't treat people the way you want to be treated, because you can't presume that the way everyone is the way you are, right? And that's where the conversation starts, by treating people the way they want to be treated. And to do that, you have to engage with them and listen to them. So that's all.
Absolutely. Thanks, Layla. And Jeremy, finally, over to you.
For me, I think reconciliation is important right now. And as public servants, a lot of the day-to-day work we do can be actioned through our day-to-day activities. So the Many Voices, One Mind is something that would be really important for all public servants to read, because we could look at that view of the Indigenous persons in our public service. Also, too, there's an Indigenous perspectives from ESDC, where there are a number of public servants that are Indigenous and interviewed and talking about the realities of working in the public service over the last few decades. And the other one is the Truth and Reconciliation Report. I encourage everyone to read all of the calls to action and think about all of those things in your day-to-day that you can do to help reconcile all of the things that we could probably do on our own work plan. So just give you an example, I have a 2-year work plan, and all of the items in my work plan are highlighted and related to one of the calls to action. So the number one is call to action number 57, which is basically providing the cultural competency and cultural awareness to all public servants. But there are many things we can do in our daily lives, which is outside of work as well, and how we do reconciliation. So those are the things that I think many folks should read. And you'll see there's a lot of similarities in all the marginalized groups when you look at the Many Voices, One Mind, and the statistics are there too. So, as Susan mentioned earlier, there's history you've seen it get better, but without taking action in our own day-to-day, we're not going to see those actions happen fast. But if we do take action every day in all of those groups, I think we as individuals will find those allies and make a difference in our workplace.
Absolutely. And Marcel has posted the link to the Many Voices, One Mind report in the chat as well. So that brings us to the end of today's Ask Me Anything on inclusion, diversity, and anti-racism. Huge thanks to Liz, to Heather, to Jeremy, to Layla, and Susan for joining us today and sharing your thoughts, sharing your experiences, and taking questions on so many different topics. Merci à nos participants de partout au Canada pour nous joindre aujourd'hui. Et puis, le vidéo de la session aujourd'hui, ça va être partagé sur notre canal YouTube. So the video will be edited and then popped onto our YouTube channel later on for any people who would like to check out this discussion later on, or if you missed any of today's panels. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. Merci à tous. Et puis, On va avoir des nouvelles séances la semaine prochaine. So we'll be resuming FYN virtual learning series on Tuesday. So check out our upcoming sessions based around career development for December as we lead into Career Bootcamp. So thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy your Friday and enjoy your weekends. And thanks very much for joining us today. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting.